Hello and welcome to the State of the Fleet Industry, a weekly video series produced by Automotive Fleet magazine and which is sponsored by Enterprise Fleet Management. I'm Mike Antich, editor of Automotive Fleet, and today I'd like to examine what's occurring in the fleet industry for the week of March 29th, 2021. So to start our presentation, what is the current state of the fleet industry? Are market conditions improving for fleets? There's a lot of anecdotal inferences we can make. We could look at fleet buying inclinations. We could look at specific fleet segments such as construction, oil and gas, the insurance industry. But what about the fleet industry as a whole? And the reality is that it's very hard to know that because the fleet industry is so diverse. We are in so many different industries and run so many different assets. But this has always been a fantasy of mine to develop a fleet index that can gauge or benchmark the vitality of the fleet industry as a whole. So for instance, if you make an analogy by looking at the overall US economy, you simply can't go about looking at just the manufacturing sector or separately at the service sector in order to gauge the vitality of the economy. You need an aggregate composite of all the segments combined. There are many indices out there that accomplish this goal. They provide you a gauge of current economic conditions that can be benchmarked against same time last year. And these economic indicators include gross domestic product, GDP, the consumer price index, or a favorite of mine, which is a procurement manager index or PMI. And there are many other indexes that are out there that are just as good. But the question is, can you develop a similar type of index for the fleet industry? And if you can, how would it look? So if you ask yourself, what are the fleet indicators that could be used as a barometer to gauge the state of the fleet industry in total? Well, fleet by its very nature involves the use of mobile assets to fulfill a variety of business functions. So it seems to me and to others that the key indicators have to focus on mobility. And here are two possible fleet indicators. One would be total miles driven per month, and another would be number of miles driven per vehicle per month. And these numbers can be benchmarked against same time last year to provide an assessment of fleet activity or fleet vitality. And likewise, another fleet indicator could be number of trips per month or the number of trips per vehicle per month. And this can be further broken down by taking these fleet indicators and comparing them within specific industry segments. So today we have this capability. I mean, this isn't anything brand new. This capability is at our fingertips, and we have very precise data to track these fleet indicators using onboard vehicle telematics devices. And the data collected from these telematics devices can be aggregated and anonymized to provide a very accurate snapshot on the state of the fleet industry in total. So for instance, Geotab, that is partnered with Enterprise Fleet Management, collects trip and mileage data, which can give us insights into the overall state of the fleet market. So if you look at this aggregated and anonymized Geotab data by examining the number of miles driven during February and March of 2021, the two most recent months, and comparing it against same time last year, February and March of 2020, we can gain some very interesting insights. So as you can see from the chart that's currently on your screen, if you look on the far left, the blue bar of the chart being displayed, it shows total miles driven in the month of February 2020, which was the last pre-pandemic month. And next to that blue bar is a red bar representing the total mileage in March 2020, which was the official onset of the pandemic and the subsequent economic lockdowns. So as you can see, in February 2020, the total miles driven that month were 1.3 billion with a B miles. And this now becomes our benchmark. It becomes our benchmark on gauging how fleet activity has declined since the official start of the pandemic in March of 2020. And likewise, by comparing this data against similar 2021 data, we can see the industry's rate of recovery as it begins to enter a post-pandemic economy. And this chart allows us to compare the months of February, which is again the blue chart, and the month of March, which is the red bar, of 2021 that are located on the right side of this chart against the same time last year, which is February, again in blue, March, again in red, of 2020, which are the two bars on the left side of the page. And while it does appear that there's marginal improvement, what surprised me, it's not dramatic improvement. And it's apparent to me that fleet is still in the midst of an economic slowdown caused by the pandemic. Now, admittedly, as has always been the case throughout this pandemic, there are some industry segments that are doing much better than others, such as last mile delivery and fleets that are operated by companies that are deemed essential businesses. But without this aggregated and anonymized data, there's a risk that we could end up focusing on these good performing fleet segments and erroneously infer that they're representative of the fleet economy as a whole, which they're not. So at best, we can say by looking at this data and the charts that I displayed on the screen, is that the fleet industry in total has improved to a marginal degree since the start of the pandemic of March 2020. But it's apparent that we still have a ways to go before this fleet industry reaches full recovery, which I define as the pre-pandemic business activity, such as what was shown in the February 2020 blue bar. So now, if we examine this aggregated and anonymized data provided by Geotab from a different perspective, which I'm showing on the screen now, we can look at the number of trips per month by fleet vehicles. So this second chart demonstrates higher miles driven than the prior chart when comparing 2021 to 2020. And while the mileages are a bit higher, when you take a deeper analysis of this data, it shows that increasingly fleets during February and March 2021 timeframes were accumulating more miles, but it was as a result of taking more shorter trips than what they did in the pre-pandemic period. But if you look at this data, it kind of reminds me of the psychological Rorschach tests, where you're looking at an abstract image and different people can have different interpretations, even though they're looking at exactly the same image. Or in the case of our discussion now, have different conclusions when looking at exactly the same data. So my interpretation at looking at this data is that I was surprised how little difference there was in total miles and total trips from the start of the pandemic in March 2020 compared to today, March 2021, 12 months later. But this is just a snapshot in time, and in the next 30 days, we'll get additional fleet activity and fleet data for the month of April 2021, and it'll be interesting to see whether there's been any sort of upward trend or whether overall mileage and the total number of trips will continue to show only marginal improvement. So time will tell. So stay tuned for my video report in 30 days from now, and we'll make this analysis. But next, I'd like to examine business activity in key fleet sectors in a bullet point format. And the largest component in a TCO analysis is depreciation. And with this in mind, I'd like to examine the wholesale used vehicle market where most fleet vehicles are remarketed. And the used vehicle market continues to be incredibly strong, primarily because of the market imbalance between supply and demand. And today, the supply of used vehicles continues to be very tight. While at the same time, retail buyer demand is very strong, and it is even being further stimulated by income tax returns and government stimulus monies. And this combination has increased used vehicle prices. And the expectation is that in the upcoming months of April and May, we're going to continue to experience strong resale prices. And likewise, the anticipation is that the tight inventory in the wholesale market is going to continue even longer into the start of the 2022 calendar year, which again is good news for fleets. So the next largest component in a TCO analysis is fuel. So let's next examine what's going on with today's fuel prices. Well, to be anticlimactic, I'm not going to be surprising anyone because everyone knows that fuel prices are continuing to increase, But what is interesting is that fleet drivers are becoming increasingly skeptical about the average statewide fuel prices that are being reported in the media. And their real world experience, as ours, are telling us that fuel prices are higher than what are being indicated in published reports. And these fleet managers and drivers continue to email us with what they're actually paying at the pump, which is invariably higher. So here's one email that was sent to Automotive Fleet from a reader living in Idaho disputing the nationwide average prices that are broken out by state. And I quote, "The information is totally incorrect. I just filled up the other day and gas was over $3.20 a gallon in Idaho on March 15th. It's gone up 50 cents per gallon in the past month." End of quote. And just when you thought you'd seen everything, we now have this to happen. As you can see, one of the world's largest container ships, the Ever Given, ran aground sideways, completely blocking both directions of traffic in the Suez Canal. So why is this important to fleet? Well, first, shipping is an integral part of the global supply chain, and it makes up 70% of all global trade. And on top of that, 12% of all global trade passes through the Suez Canal. So this is a significant choke point to the global supply chain. And second, oil is a global commodity whose price is influenced by global supply and demand. And much of the oil earmarked for Europe is transported through the Suez Canal. And while this type of blockage will disrupt oil supply primarily in the European markets, remember that oil is a global commodity and is based on global pricing. So it will have an impact on overall global pricing. But this blockage isn't permanent. In fact, it should be resolved, I hope it is, by the time you view this video. But this blockage of the Suez Canal created a new temporary supply chain disruption. But what's more important, in my mind at least, is who could have predicted this? My point is that the cause of supply chain disruptions nowadays are totally unpredictable. And here's another unpredictable supply chain disruption that occurred this year, which is the microchip shortage. Now it seems like that's the only thing we talk about. And in fact, the ongoing microchip shortage will get even tighter, namely worse, in the next 2 months of April and May. And with each passing week, the list of assembly plants being temporarily closed continues to grow. In North America, plants are being idled not only in the US, but also Mexico and Canada due to the chip shortage. Stellantis is idling its minivan production at its Windsor plant in Canada. Toyota cut production at 4 plants that are located in Mexico, Kentucky, and West Virginia. Honda idled the majority of its North American assembly plants all of last week, the week of March 22nd. And all OEMs, whether they're GM, Ford, VW, Nissan, and so forth, are being impacted. No OEM is unaffected by the microchip shortage. And to keep production moving, some vehicles are being assembled minus the microchips and parked until the chips become available for final assembly. And this speaks once again to the total unpredictability of supply chain disruptions. Who would have predicted this back in 2020? As I close this presentation, I'd like to take a look at the emergence of a new employment category, which is called virtual sales managers. So what is a virtual sales manager and why is this important to fleet? Virtual sales managers are salespeople who in the past have been assigned a company vehicle and called on customers or sales prospects in the field, but who are now dedicated to solely working with these customers and sales prospects in a virtual environment without a company vehicle. And this is starting to gain traction, especially in the pharma industry, which has been experimenting with online webinars with doctors to conform to their busy schedules even prior to the pandemic. But the pandemic is accelerating the movement of sales management in this direction. Now, I'm not being an alarmist. Fleet is not going away, but online sales will grow, and people who in years past might have been assigned a company vehicle will be in the future selling remotely without a company vehicle. And I'll discuss this thought-provoking development in more detail in future reports. But until then, I'd like to conclude my State of the Industry presentation for the week of March 29, 2021, and I'd like to thank you for listening.